the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. 2017 was a year in which things like Donald Trump's tweets and undisclosed meetings with Russians and Trump campaign officials made front page news. Now, no matter where you stand on the importance of those stories, inevitably, many important issues were lost in the shuffle. Well, my next guest has just written a piece going through some of the stories that we may have missed in 2017. The story is called The Top 10 Undercovered News Stories of 2017, and it's by Adam Johnson, a media analyst for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting and co-host of the podcast Citations Needed. Adam, before we go through your list, your just overall reflections on the news of the year and how some important stories were lost in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, the day-to-day kind of breathless coverage of, I mean, I guess you're obviously a Russiagate skeptic. I would sort of put myself generally in that category. You know, if the president did indeed collude with the foreign government, that's obviously a huge story. But I think the issue has always been one of proportionality. You know, it's not that these stories aren't important; it's that they really do just consume the bulk of the daily, you know, front page coverage. What's trending on Twitter, like the latest kind of Mueller probe tea leaf reading, and I think all that's fine. I just think it sort of really does consume the bulk of our attention, and I think that what I tried to do with this piece and what I try to do with my editor at the LA Times is sort of try to highlight news that really wasn't covered that I thought was important to the extent it needed to be covered. And that I think is, and to remind people that, you know, the world, there are other things going on. And you know, when you have the leading nominal liberal network like MSNBC, that is basically just a 24-hour Russia commercial. You know, I think that it's things like the J20 prosecution, where 2 journalists and 200 protesters were facing 10 to 65 years in prison for the simple crime of being in the proximity of a few broken Starbucks windows. Things like the border deaths in Mexico, and Trump's escalations of the wars in Iraq and Syria, as well as the rising death toll there. You know, these things were really not covered. To say nothing, of course, about anything to dealing with Palestine. MSNBC never covers Palestine. I didn't mention it here because that's sort of an evergreen story of not being covered. But until last week's Jerusalem story, for example, MSNBC had gone 2 years and only mentioned Palestine one time. So their priorities to me are entirely out of whack.
In 2 years of coverage, MSNBC had not mentioned Palestine and the Palestinians, except for just once.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, twice.
Twice.
It was a total of 9 minutes. So from November of 2015 to just November of 2016, or November 2017. I went through. I did a pretty exhaustive search and found 2 segments on Palestine, both of which were aired in the afternoon, both of which were comprised about 9 minutes of coverage out of over 1 million minutes of coverage. So yeah, I mean, again, I think the issue with the Russia thing is always an issue of proportionality.
Adam, did they cover Israel but just not mention Palestine and the Palestinians?
Yeah, so I categorized it by actually mentioning Palestine. Yeah, like there had to be a meaningful reference to Palestine. And keep in mind that the only reason they started covering it this month was because of Trump's Jerusalem move, right, which they viewed through a partisan lens. And then in their defense, they did sort of bring on more Palestinians this month. But it's not, you know, they don't typically cover the issue unless there's some obviously American involvement. But the idea that America is always involved in the permanent occupation of Palestine for going on 50, 70 years, depending how you define it, is I think a scandal for this sort of nominal liberal network, right?
Right. And this gets to the issue of also partisan utility. Often issues like this,
yes,
like Palestine, like Yemen, are not covered unless there's some partisan use for them. But before we get to that, we'll get back to Yemen. Let's go through your list one by one. So you start off the list with the disenfranchisement of African American voters.
Yeah, it should be a really huge scandal, but efforts by Republicans to slowly disenfranchise African Americans over the past few years. It really started with the wave of the Tea Party in 2010. Of course, it always had been going on forever, right? It never really stopped, but that was really when it started the uptick, because Republicans started taking over House legislators, like pretty systematically. And so as the Republicans began to take over, they started passing really draconian voter ID laws. They started, basically purging people from the voter rolls. Some people have been trying to highlight this, and it just seems like it's one of those things where it's so sort of baked into the cake of this country. There's not really a lot of attention paid to it, and there's not really an inciting incident where you say, okay, this happened today. But the amount of disenfranchised voters in major swing states like Wisconsin was, I think, a huge scandal that didn't really get enough coverage. And people have tried to sort of highlight, and MSNBC has sort of mentioned it a few times, but generally it's just not a sexy story. So we put it number one on the list.
Right. The reporter who I think has done the most work on this is Ari Berman, First of the Nation. Now he's at Mother Jones. And he's just been dogged on the story. And, now obviously I am a Russiagate skeptic, but whenever I see Ari Berman's stories, I wonder, like, what if the media put just half the resources that it puts into Russiagate, and that uncover all these Russiagate pieces into voter suppression. Of
course they would argue that you could do both. In theory that's possible, but in practice that almost never happens. And what I want to be careful to do is I want to be careful not to use these stories as part of a broader proxy war against the Russiagate issue, because I think that's kind of cynical. I think it is useful as a point of reference, right? But I want to be clear that at least I'm not saying that you can't both care about Russia and these stories. I just think that manifestly, as far as the percentage of coverage from liberal outlets, that ends up being the case.
Fair enough, Adam. I'll just say that I'm generally anti-proxy war, but in this case, as you can tell, I think it's justifiable. But I take your point. So let's move on to the South Korean peace movement.
Yes. So the coverage of Korea in general is very bad. One of the things that's completely omitted from the narrative is that the people of South Korea, on average, in the aggregate, and there's obvious exceptions, are far, far less militant and warmongering than the U.S. media is. Now, there's a few reasons for that. Number one, South Korea was a fascist state for several decades, so there's a tremendous activist and left-wing movements there, because they did live under a fascist dictatorship, and they oppose the THAAD missile system, which was accelerated by Trump, started under Obama, and the fact that the majority of South Koreans believed that the THAAD missile system should be suspended, and ultimately elected a president who did so, was completely omitted. And what you had in U.S. media was stories that were populated by weapons contract funded think tanks like CSIS and warmongers like Lindsey Graham. And so they sort of consumed all the oxygen on the North Korea issue. And the voices of the South Koreans and the activist community there, and frankly the majority of South Koreans, when you look at polling, are far less hostile and are far more focused on peace and reconciliation eventually than they are trying to overthrow the government of North Korea.
Adam, just to exemplify what you're talking about there when it comes to sound bites, let's go to a clip of Lindsey Graham talking about the Korean Peninsula.
There are two scenarios where we would go to war with North Korea. If they attack Guam or some other American interest or our allies, or if they try to keep developing a ICBM with a nuclear weapon on top to hit the homeland, we would act. President Trump has basically drawn a red line, saying that he'll never allow North Korea to have an ICBM missile that can hit America with a nuclear weapon on top. He's not going to let that happen. He's not going to contain the threat. He's going to stop the threat. I hope we can do this diplomacy, and sanctions. A war would be terrible, but if there's going to be a war, it's going to be in the region, not here in America.
So that's Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. Adam, moving on to number 3, you have President Trump's non-Russia corruption.
Yeah, President Trump is by far the most corrupt president, the most conflicted president we've ever had. Now, obviously, all presidents are going to be corrupt by definition since they manage a largely benevolent empire. But Trump has sort of taken it to kind of cartoon lengths. His sons run his business operations, which he constantly branding himself while he still profits off his business. To say nothing of the fact that we still don't have his tax returns, which is unprecedented. So I mean, again, these things are kind of at this point banal because he sort of owns the fact that he's so corrupt. But the fact of that corruption, the type of scandals that would ruin any other president, are sort of kind of yawn-inducing. We're kind of like, oh well, that's just Trump. But at the same time, the journalists who have done good work on this at the New York Times, for example, like there isn't any kind of inciting incident to make it a scandal. And I think that if you actually like objectively step back and look at Trump's corruption, it's quite shocking. It's quite shockingly brazen. And yet the story doesn't really break into the news cycle. One of the reasons is that Trump is really good at framing the day's media narrative by tweeting really early in the morning. And then so for the rest of the day, we're kind of chasing that story. And it's kind of a brilliant move on his part since he basically sets the agenda. And people have noticed this, of course, and tried not to fall into the trap, but it's sort of impossible not to.
And moving on to number 4, you have the U.S. helped to bomb and starve Yemen. This is something that's been going on for many years now, but still not getting the attention that it merits, especially given the extent of the U.S. role in Yemen's catastrophe.
Yeah, so the 60 Minutes did a 13-minute report on the bombing and using starvation as a weapon of war in Yemen. And shockingly, even by corporate media standards, did not even mention the U.S. involvement. And in fact, did a 180 and presented the U.S. through the World Food Aid Program, and the head of the World Food Aid Program is an American. They presented them as the heroes of the story. So it was pretty perverse. And then of course, the Washington Post had that same month had 2 separate editorials condemning the Saudi bombing of Yemen and sort of moral posturing. And neither of them mentioned the U.S. involvement, which of course, according to even the I would say pretty pro-war Brookings Institute and the Council on Foreign Relations, both of whom acknowledge that without U.S. support there would be no war in Yemen. That it's not just a sort of incidental support. That the U.S. is actually a fundamental part of the war itself, and without it there would be no war. So the media started and they sort of vaguely paid attention to it because it has escalated under Trump. But U.S. involvement is being consistently whitewashed, and Saudi Arabia is treated as this kind of rogue Arab country that's not doing so at the behest of the U.S.
Right, and this gets to the issue of partisan utility that we were speaking about before. Your colleague at FAIR, Ben Norton, has a piece coming out soon about media coverage of Yemen over the past year. And he points out that on MSNBC, there was an uptick in coverage at the beginning of the year when Trump came into office and ordered that raid on a Yemeni village that killed many Yemeni civilians, but also led to the death of a U.S. Navy SEAL. And it was that death that got a lot of attention because it could be used by Democrats to go after President Trump. And that's when Ben Norton says that Yemen got some coverage. But after that, in the months afterwards, pretty much nothing.
Yeah, because it doesn't have partisan utility, because it's a war that Obama started and Obama supported. Trump, sort of kind of like all these things, right? He escalated it, but he was fundamentally just carrying out what Obama was doing before.
Do you think that inside these newsrooms they discuss Yemen and they ask themselves if it's worth covering? I mean, how do you think that the process works where it's just decided that it's not worth covering unless there's something major that has partisan use, like the killing of a Navy SEAL?
It's factored in. Dead brown people are factored in. They don't care. The only time they do care is when it helps U.S. imperialism, like when Russians bomb Syria, then they suddenly care and they're outraged by it. And when it's U.S. or Saudi or Emirati bombing, it doesn't have political utility and it undermines the narrative of U.S. as moral arbiter, and so they just don't care. The thing is that most editorial boards and most editors are fundamentally about preserving the ideological framework of U.S. imperialism as a sort of good, and so when it undermines that, to the extent they can even have coverage, like you see in the case of Vox, for example, it's framed as Saudi Arabia is somehow tarnishing our good moral value, and that they've somehow, you see this a lot, Saudi Arabia drags the U.S. into war, Saudi Arabia compels. Fareed Zakaria said Saudi Arabia played Trump into supporting their war. So even when the U.S. involvement is acknowledged, we're framed as some sort of benevolent actor who's sort of gone astray, but we're fundamentally good. And a story that so blatantly undermines that narrative has to be ignored because the cognitive dissonance is too great.
All right, so that's going to wrap part one of our discussion with Adam Johnson on the top 10 undercover news stories of 2017. Join us in part 2.